Welcome back, everyone. This is a very meaningful episode. It's the first episode in 2 years. I haven't been down here since March 2020, and it's now end of Feb, almost March 2022. And I'm here with a very special guest, Danny Egol, who took my class the first year I taught it at Yale SOM and went on to launch the venture that he was imagining during that semester and succeeding in reimagining the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I want to welcome you and thank you so much, A, for visiting my class today, sharing your work, for the work that you're doing, and for being the super special relaunching of the podcast guest.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and it feels surreal as a former alum who didn't really get to graduate in the March of 2020 class.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be back.
It's nice to be back. We just started 2 weeks in person 2 weeks ago, and so this feels almost too good to be true, so fingers crossed. So while I have you here, yes, I'd love to start off by having you introduce yourself and your organization and tell us a little bit about what it does.
Sure. My name is Danny Egol. I was born in Ossining, New York, just north of New York City, to a Cuban-Israeli mother and a Jewish-American father. And those things were really important to me because I grew up with multiple languages in my house, and I'm part of the LGBTQ+ community, and that was never an issue in my home. But I very quickly saw a world around me that wasn't really great with difference. And that was particularly salient when I went to Cuba for the first time to visit my family there when I was 13. And it was shortly thereafter, when I got to experience the country and see it for myself, that the borders reclosed, that the Bush administration revoked family visitation rights. And the reasons I was hearing on the news were so different from the reality I'd experienced on the island that I began to see that when cultures are not understood, when people are afraid of difference, when we put up walls to prevent access to family, real communities can have impact, and not always in a positive way. And so I've ever since, even though I didn't necessarily have the language around diversity, equity, and inclusion, have been thinking about identity-based questions of community and how we build spaces where everyone can really be their full selves and be successful. And so after college, I worked for 5 years at an organization called Cook Ross in Washington, D.C. that does DEI consulting, helping organizations all over the world really navigate questions of culture and how they build teams and an environment, and as well as programs and services and products with a DEI lens. And it was from my experiences there that I saw some gaps in the field, which I'm more than happy to talk about, that have really been the driving force behind the organization that I now run.
And your organization refers to DEI as ideas. So you kind of reorder and add 2 more letters. So tell us more about your organization is called Ideas Generation. So what is ideas?
Yes, great question. So it's an unfortunately long acronym, and we know it's not the
beautiful.
easiest thing
to
say.
It.
But I think it's really important for a few reasons. And DEI has been the evolution of work that I think really clearly dates back to the civil rights era and the real and important movement for Black liberation and justice. But ideas is DEI plus access and social justice, and those 2 components are really important to me. The first around access is first to honor the disability rights movement and the importance of thinking about both the built environment and the cultural environment for folks with disabilities. But it also refers to the many other kinds of barriers that could prevent meaningful engagement in our communities and relationships. So for example, you and I are having this conversation in the podcast basement in English, but we could be very easily doing it in Spanish or Arabic or Russian or any other number of languages. We're also being able to tape this podcast because we have access to technology that can record it, and that is not something that everyone universally has access to.
And people need internet to listen or view.
Exactly.
And they need hearing and seeing.
Exactly. So for us, making sure that we're approaching our work with an access lens is really important and something that I think is often left out of the conversation. And S for social justice, because as a nonprofit, as an organization that is values driven, we've seen a lot of companies that have pursued this work because of its financial benefits when you have more diverse teams, more innovative thinking. And that is important. But for us, it really is all about creating a world where everyone can thrive, regardless of the financial benefit that may bring. And so for us, we're really about partnering with leaders and organizations that are in this for the human reason, beyond the financials.
It's really interesting that you anchor it and trace back ideas, or what others refer to as DEI, as starting with the civil rights and disability rights movements in the US. And I think many people forget to do that because oftentimes these acronyms are used in a corporate setting to refer to how organizations are working to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion, even though these challenges and goals are really at a societal level. And one expression that comes up a lot in my course or in my writing is nothing about us without us. And I hadn't heard that before. And I went and looked it up and traced it back to the disability rights movement. Like, why are people designing solutions for people with disabilities without people with disabilities? And that really is significant because it links to knowledge equity. I've mentioned before in this podcast, my colleague Baljit Sandhu, who created the Center for Knowledge Equity, and spoke in my class when you took it. And she started the LEX movement in the UK, the lived experience movement, saying if you want to create access and social justice, you start by finding people with lived experience, and they'll tell you what you need to do. You don't need to brainstorm on a whiteboard with Post-its to find solutions. You talk to people who are affected by this problem, and it sounds like you are a lived experience leader, and you also have made sure to reflect that knowledge equity in the sense that, I guess for our listeners who aren't familiar with knowledge equity, it basically means that lived experience is as important, if not more important, than learned experience, and that there's so many different types of knowledge, whether it's learned, professional, volunteer, or personal experience. And they all hold value, and if we want to create long-lasting social change and systems change, we really need all those forms of knowledge at the table. So tell me a little bit about how you've been doing that. I guess your solution does just that, brings people to the table.
Yeah, so while I was working at Cook Ross, there were a few things that I noticed and colleagues of mine noticed together. So this was certainly not a venture that was started by me alone. I had two amazing colleagues, Mignon Tolan and Hannah Mack, who were really the driving force behind this idea. And essentially, we found that there were 4 things happening in our space that we felt we actually might be able to create some form of change around. The first was that folks who were interested in doing DEI or ideas work were really isolated. That often if they held a professional role or title responsibility for this work, they were often a team of one. They were often isolated organizationally from other parts of their teams, and they were geographically isolated because they were a team of one who existed in a company environment, and then there'd be maybe one in different pockets of companies in other parts of the country, but they weren't actually connected. The second was that there's just a lot of folks who are joining the space, particularly in light of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd and many others, and our sort of renewed reckoning around race in this country. But as a result of so many new folks coming in, organizations and communities have a really hard time discerning quality and standards and how we measure impact, and so there's a lot of noise in our space right now. The other thing is that there's no real pipeline for talent, so there's no degree program with the one exception of Bentley College just announced the first ever DEI major at an undergraduate institution. But aside from them, there's a few certificate programs that I'd offer are probably of varying quality. And so there's a great desire for folks to do this work, but there's very few pipeline opportunities to make sure that they have the skills, background, and experiences that makes meaningful impact. And that a lot of the times as well, we would see organizations that really needed this support, but financially just couldn't access it because organizations like Cook Ross could charge really high prices that were not affordable to them. And so all of those things we were seeing in organizations, and there felt like there was this untapped potential, particularly with next generation leaders, folks who were thinking about the future, who wanted to take a more intergenerational, innovative approach to the work. So it's not about compliance, it's not solely about internal culture, it's about thinking about how do we co-create systems where these values are the ethos comprehensively in our programs and services, in our governance structures, in our teams, in how we build partnerships, and really wrapping this around. And so in part, I felt like I was designing something in partnership with my colleagues that we ourselves wanted. We weren't designing for someone else, we were designing for ourselves, which made things a bit easier. But one of our founding premises is this idea of co-creation, that nothing about us without us also means that we need to be equal partners in creating something that will serve us all. And so all of our programs and services, as well as our partnerships with organizations, are really predicated on that we all bring these different forms of knowledge to the table, and that our best efforts are done when those things are able to surface.
So you went from this huge problem of inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and social justice, and broke it down into specific pain points in the industry.
Yep.
It sounds like the customer you identified is young professionals who want to work in this industry, and there wasn't a pipeline for them, they weren't connected to each other. And also it seems like the second customer segment is organizations that wanted to work on this but couldn't afford the existing players, right?
Yep.
And so tell us a little bit about how you went from breaking down that large social challenge to understanding who the customers and the pain points are, and then what are the services and products that you offer?
Sure. So I think the catalyzing moment for us, Mignon, Hannah, and myself, is when we would go to industry conferences and we would see the trailblazers of our field connect, and they would hug, and they would have these reunions that everyone would be so excited to watch, because you could see that these are longtime friends, people who have been in the trenches together for a very long time. But then you would notice, like us, that we, the people behind them, didn't know each other. That they would have been so busy doing the amazing work that they didn't have the time to invest in making sure that others around them were connected and had that same level of relationship. And so
you're the next generation, literally, like the second generation of this work.
Exactly. And I think the work itself needs to change. So there's a bit of like field building that we're trying to do to make it more relevant, and more, and what I mean relevant is using frameworks like intersectionality that acknowledges that we have many different kinds of identities, and the combination of them may have different kinds of impacts depending on who we are. And it's not just, I'm not just a Latino man, I'm not just a white man. I know there's many things about me that are in combination and therefore create a unique experience. And so in that desire to build the field, we realized, well, we need people to build it with, and there's a lot of interest and desire, but few avenues in which to do that. And so our first sort of set of services was just thinking about how do we bring people together who we know in our network, maybe one step removed, two steps removed, but might be interested in thinking about what would more collaboration in our space, more connection look like. And so we started as a platform using Slack and a series of virtual community conversations just to bring people together to say, hey, I exist, I'm struggling with this question, have you had to deal with it too? What does this look like in your context? And as the pandemic hit, we realized that there was a lot of shifts taking place in people figuring out hybrid work situations and figuring out how to coexist with the pandemic. And so we started reaching out to folks who had been in these community conversations, who are on our Slack channel, to say, hey, what do you need? What are you experiencing?
Because you were actually launching this as a student here right before the pandemic, right?
Yes.
Like you took my class spring 2019, and then you graduated spring 2020.
Yes.
So, yeah, you launched in a pandemic.
The middle of pandemic. Yes. And while the pandemic has been horrible and had played a tremendous toll on so many people, the silver lining for us has been in people's shift to figuring out how to navigate a world of a pandemic, that desire for connection really got elevated for people because they were so physically separated. And as a result, what we heard from these many conversations with people was saying, everyone and their mother is putting up a podcast, everyone is putting up a webinar, and we don't need more content. What we really need are facilitated spaces to collectively and collaboratively workshop the challenges that they're facing as they emerge. And so that was really what bore out our idea for an ideas roundtable, so to bring people in curated cohorts of similarly situated peers to discuss and work through challenges of how are you dealing with burnout? What does this mean now that we're dealing with both COVID and this racial reckoning? How are you taking care of yourselves? What does strategy look like? How are you making shifts in this virtual hybrid world? And we started to see an amazing amount of coalescence around this need for community that was also action-oriented. And so that was sort of our big pivot in terms of creating more communal spaces for learning and skill and capacity development. And the second shift that we saw during that time was that people would start to say, hey, our organization needs this help. It's not just me as an individual who is appreciating having this kind of learning community, but we need to actually bring this to scale at an institution. And initially, we as an organization didn't want to do consulting work because we felt like the field already had a lot of players, that as a nonprofit, we didn't really feel that it was sort of our sort of founding charter to deliver services in that way. But what we started to see was that by working with nonprofits and social impact organizations under a certain size, we could actually advance our mission so long as we are actually bringing along the folks in our leadership and community programs as contractors onto the projects, so that folks could actually get hands-on compensated experience doing really quality work, but at a price point that would make it accessible to these organizations that would have been otherwise priced out of the market.
And I know our listeners have been thinking, Slack channel, roundtables, how is he making money out of this? So it sounds like it kind of grew organically. Like first you identify the need and you just start the work. And then based on what I understand, you have two revenue models that are making you financially sustainable, which is that individuals pay to be part of this community and they bring in their employers who pay for consulting services. Can you expand on both of, or the first component?
Sure. So just to clarify for our community, folks don't have to pay in, but if they want to attend specific workshops or events, and particularly the roundtables, there is a program fee, but it's all pay as you can. So people will self-select saying, I can pay the price that we have recommended or requested. People say I can pay that and more, knowing that anything above that price will then go into supporting someone who can't. Some people pay partial amounts, some people pay in installments, some people don't pay at all. So it's really designed to make sure that everyone can participate regardless of financial circumstance.
Okay.
But then with organizations, that the contributions that they make financially for services around that typically take the arc of a multi-year partnership, because this work doesn't happen in a day. And as you've heard me say, lots of organizations have come asking for one-off trainings. And I think that's just because it's what's visible and it's the thing that people can identify in terms of what is ideas work. But I use the metaphor of it's like eating a salad, hoping that you'll live a healthy life forever, but eating a salad once is not going to do it. So these partnerships financially help cross-subsidize our other programs while also making sure that we're developing and compensating the pipeline of young leaders doing this work.
So you did it, Danny. I mean, you decided you want to work on this, you just started doing the work, and you found a way to make it financially sustainable. And I think that what you're doing is really reflective of what we talk about in class in terms of systems thinking and systems strengthening, because we always say it's identifying who the existing stakeholders are and changing the way that they work together, right? Like there is a system around DEI. How can we make that better?
Yep.
And also, I think I've referred in the past to the Ashoka. Ashoka is an organization that supports social entrepreneurs, and they have this beautiful illustration of the 4 levels of impact, where they start with direct service, like a teacher teaching a student, and then scaled direct service, like reaching many students, and then systems change, changing the education system, and lastly, framework change, changing the way people think about education or think about DEI and ideas. And I think ideas is framework change, right? You're trying to change the underlying beliefs and patterns and mindsets of society through the ideas community. I won't call it DEI anymore. Let's just be consistent and call it through the ideas community. So you're doing systems change and framework change, which is really cool. I want to go back to this aspect of the pandemic, because you mentioned that when you identified your customers, who are next generation leaders working in ideas, and you identified their pain points, one of those pain points was that they felt isolated from each other. And hence the Slack channels, the panels, all those roundtables, et cetera. What role do you think the pandemic felt in this isolation and need for connection? Because I've been seeing it in everything, not just in the ideas world, right?
Yes. So there are a few key impacts that I think the pandemic has had, and I'm sure there are many others, but the ones that come to mind, at least for now, are first and foremost, because the pandemic required a virtual shift for those who were able in their work, it actually offered new platforms for connection that had you been going to an office and going to in-person meetings, you may not have had the time or flexibility to actually invest in. So people were more willing, because other options were no longer available, to connect in a virtual format in perhaps ways that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The other thing was that I think the pandemic, and it continues to, is elevate the importance of mental health and wellness. And so 2 of my colleagues are formally trained in psychological first aid, trauma-informed care, healing-centered design. And so a lot of what our community does is be a place for nourishment where people can go to recharge, because if you are doing ideas work in an organization formally or informally, it is often because you are pretty proximate to the systems that are harming you, whether it be racism, sexism, ableism, ageism. And so in dealing with that while trying to navigate all of the stressors of a pandemic, people just needed a space to be able to exhale. And to be in community to do that, I think, was very powerful for people. And as the world is shifting to more of a hybrid maintenance of life with the pandemic, we're now trying to figure out how do we adjust to meet people in the real world outside of our virtual platforms, because now those competing commitments are starting to surge because you don't have to be glued to your computer in the same way. And we don't want people to be.
You don't have to work from home if you had that opportunity.
Exactly.
I think everyone was looking for connection and community during the pandemic, not just ideas leaders. And I think everyone found their own ways of creating connection and community. And I think in terms of ideas, one thing that emerged was also mental health. Mental health has not been at the forefront of diversity, equity, inclusion conversations, but it was in the training that we did at SOM in terms of this is one form of the way people are different. And I think what I tell my students, the more I talk to people, the more people reveal what each person is going through. I think they had to address a lot of mental health issues during the pandemic. A lot of them were exacerbated. I really think mental health is one form of diversity. Like, there is this image that's incorrect that people have about normal. Like, there's this thing called normal, and that's what I'm supposed to be, and I'm not normal. Many people feel that way, and it's a misperception. It's like, no, that doesn't exist. There's a normal distribution maybe where everyone is different, but we're distributed around some median, but there's no such thing as normal. You're all supposed to be different. You're all supposed to have mental health needs, and let's talk about those. I think that has been happening more and more, and I think that will allow us to create workplaces and communities where people can address their mental health needs and their other needs.
Absolutely, and it's an important part of our internal culture too, acknowledging that if we're supporting folks who are supporting others, that we also need to be doing that work internally. And so one of the things I'm really proud of, and I'll have to think about how we finesse this as we grow, but is that every 2 weeks folks have a floating mental health day. So that every member of our team gets to pick every 10 work days, I can just take one off just to make sure I'm taking care of myself. And we've never seen any sort of dip in productivity or commitment. And it's been really amazing to have our team be really open about how are we feeling about our work, how are we feeling with the world outside. And my colleague Desi, who is just phenomenal and is very open about this, is someone who identifies as neurodivergent, that they don't have the same sort of emotional regulation and mental processes as other folks do. And very openly identifies as bipolar. And so for me to be her colleague, and for her to be able to not only disclose that, but see it as an asset so we can really cater to her needs and so that she can do her best work, has been incredibly humbling and powerful for me, and it brings us closer. And so I find that the more that we can find spaces and ways to create connection, the better work you can end up doing.
I mean, this really strikes a chord with me in terms of my public health prevention background, and I know that most organizations have sick days where you can call in sick, but it makes so much more sense from a wellness, public health, and economic productivity point of view to not wait for those sick days to happen. Just have a mental health day or other health prevention day.
Yeah, and we have whole protocols, so when Desi is on an upswing, we know exactly how to make sure that she's taken care of and gets to do the things she needs to do, and when she's on a downswing, same thing. So we've been able to design our teams and our workflows in a way that actually acknowledges and honors that part of her experience, and it really has been nothing but really wonderful, at least for me, and I hope that's the case for her.
That's excellent to hear, and big shout out to Desi.
Yeah, she's pretty phenomenal, and so are Imani and Sage, my other colleagues.
And so I wonder what your thoughts are about how things are going to evolve in the future as they relate to this question of isolation, connectivity, and community in the pandemic. What do you think are going to be some of the future patterns as we emerge, hopefully, in future years from this way of living? Do you think these needs will persist? And what do you think are some of the ways that you're seeing in your work people will continue to address them and find ways to connect and create community?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think the needs will go away. I think how they'll be addressed and where they're addressed might change. So one of the things that I'm learning now as an employer, which is a new hat that I'm wearing since SOM, is I think a lot of organizations and people who own organizations or run them have an unfair set of expectations that are ever expanding about what the organization itself is supposed to do, regardless if it's ideas related or not. We've sort of, particularly in the pandemic, because people's time in the absence of being able to do other things that would not be work that have been taken away because of the pandemic, are spending a lot more concentrated time working. And as a result, I have seen a pattern where myself and others have sort of expanded what we expect from our employer. They are our healthcare provider, of course. They are our main source of income, but they're also our social outlet. They're the place where we learn and grow. They're where we develop relationships. And I don't necessarily think those are bad things, but I'm wondering about how expectations may shift as the world reopens in a different way. And so for us, I think the importance of centering relationships and connection as part of our work won't go away. For example, at all of our internal meetings, we start every meeting with a completely unrelated check-in question. Nothing to do with our work. And actually the most divisive thing we've learned so far is that our team has very strong feelings about the different color of grapes. Half our team is very strong team red and half our team green. It's been really hard to learn that about some of my colleagues. But I think stuff like that will help us to continue fostering our relationships regardless of whether or not we're in person together or virtual. But I can imagine that we'll have to continue to be creative because people's needs will adapt over time depending on the circumstances that they're facing.
Well, thank you again, Danny, for this truly symbolic first podcast in 2 years. I'm really happy to have you here. Really, really grateful for the work that you, Desi, Sage, and Imani are doing, Ideas Generation. Thank you for your work and for taking this time to visit us in person and share your work with us.
Well, it's been a privilege. Thank you for having me, and please feel free to reach out anytime.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks to our listeners for rejoining us. And we have a couple of really exciting podcasts lined up for this spring, so we hope to see you back here. Thanks, everyone.